All right, everybody, grab a seat. Let's get settled. Welcome back. I'm absolutely thrilled to dive into today's explainer with you guys because we're tackling one of the most, frankly, misunderstood and complex eras in all of American history. We spend so much time talking about the monumental victories of the early 1960s civil rights movement, right? But what actually happens after those massive laws are signed? Well, today we're unpacking that post 1965 landscape. We're going to look at what changed, what didn't change, and how the fight for equality completely transformed. So here's our game plan for today. We'll start with our do now, examine the limits of the law, look at cities in crisis, pivot to the 1968 turning point, explore the rise of Black Power, and finish up with a quick lesson review. Oh, and a quick reminder before we jump in, we literally have exactly 20 classes left until the Regents exam. So if you need to do any quiz makeups, please come see me after class. Okay, let's get right into it. Section 1, the do now, assessing 1964 and 1965. Okay, let's dive into this with a little opening activity. I want you to mentally fill in the blank for this sentence stem. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965 provided equal rights for African Americans, but what? I mean, these were literally landmark historic pieces of legislation that gave massive protections to African Americans. So, were folks suddenly satisfied? Why or why not? Just kind of hold your answer in the back of your mind, because that paradox is the absolute core of our entire lesson today. Which brings us to Section 2, the limits of the law. Now, the legacy of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act is absolutely massive, no question. But they left some glaring, incredibly deep-rooted issues completely untouched. Specifically, they didn't fix systemic poverty, they didn't end de facto segregation, and they certainly didn't fix the massive inequalities in the criminal justice system. To put that into perspective, let's check out the poverty data from around 1965. At that time, the poverty rate for white Americans was sitting at around 13%. But for Black Americans, it was over 40%. Over 40%. So what does this tell us? It tells us that equality on paper definitely didn't magically translate into economic equality in everyday reality. And this brilliantly illustrates another huge gap: incarceration rates. In 1960, the rate for white inmates was actually remarkably low, especially when you compare it to the staggering spike for Black inmates, which sat well over 1,200 per 100,000 people. These numbers point straight to systemic failures in the criminal justice system, failures that those brand new civil rights laws just didn't even touch. Now, to really understand why things stayed so deeply unequal, we need to nail down an absolutely crucial vocabulary term: de facto segregation. Basically, this means segregation that exists in actual fact, regardless of what the law says. So even when Jim Crow laws, the laws that legally mandated segregation, were finally struck down, segregation itself still persisted strongly in reality. Neighborhoods and schools, they were still deeply, deeply divided. And that brings us to the lingering legacy of Jim Crow, which basically evolved into what we now call systemic racism. Systemic racism is racism that's literally embedded right into the laws, regulations, and everyday functions of a society. It's not just about, one individual person's prejudice. It's about an entire system being structured in a way that inherently disadvantages a specific group of people. Let's look at a really concrete historical example of how systemic racism was actively practiced. Have you guys heard of redlining? Redlining was the widespread practice of denying government-insured mortgages for neighborhoods that banks deemed risky. And, well, historically speaking, risky was essentially just a code word for neighborhoods where Black people lived. Check out this actual residential security map of uptown Manhattan. Entire neighborhoods were given grades, and the ones that were outlined and shaded in red, literally redlined, were officially deemed too risky for government-backed loans. And since home ownership is literally the primary way American families build and pass down generational wealth, these government practices deliberately and systematically blocked African Americans from building that wealth. It kept poverty rates artificially and intentionally high. All of this economic exclusion perfectly sets the stage for Section 3, cities in crisis. So we're going to shift our geographical focus a bit here. We're moving away from the Jim Crow South and looking instead at the really harsh conditions in northern cities between 1965 and 1970. What went down in these northern cities was basically a devastating cyclical chain reaction. Let's trace the steps here. First, you had this intense combination of extreme poverty and rampant police brutality, which created an absolute powder keg. Second, all that built-up tension exploded into frequent, large-scale urban riots throughout the late 60s. Third, the sheer destruction from those riots led to even higher, more intense poverty within the inner cities. And finally, number 4, this prompted what's known as white flight. White residents rapidly packed up and moved away to the suburbs. And when they left, they took their tax dollars and resources with them, which of course cycled right back around to causing even more profound poverty back in the cities. Just look at the stark contrast here. On one side, we've got the painful aftermath of urban riots, a heavy military presence standing right in the middle of a destroyed inner city neighborhood. And right alongside that, the sprawling, wealthy, perfectly manicured lawns of the suburbs, which were booming as a direct result of white flight. This massive demographic shift left northern cities deeply impoverished and, you guessed it, highly segregated, completely de facto. Now, this growing urban crisis definitely didn't go unnoticed by movement leaders. Welcome to Section 4, the 1968 turning point. Martin Luther King Jr. recognized that the civil rights movement absolutely had to evolve. He strategically shifted his focus directly toward tackling poverty and racism up north and in these major cities. So in 1968, MLK launched the Poor People's Campaign. The focus of this march on Washington was now squarely on economics. King was actively demanding an economic Bill of Rights. He realized, quite profoundly, that the right to sit at an integrated lunch counter honestly didn't mean much if you simply couldn't afford to buy a hamburger. But as we know, 1968 was a tragic, incredibly turbulent year. Let's walk through this timeline. Early in the year, MLK pivots his focus to northern cities. Then, on March 29th, he's down in Memphis, Tennessee, supporting a strike by a black sanitation workers union, again, focusing hard on economics. But then tragically, in April of 1968, Dr. King is assassinated. His murder immediately sparks massive, heartbroken, and furious riots across the entire country. And it's actually in the direct aftermath of those riots that the government finally passes the Civil Rights Act of 1968, better known as the Fair Housing Act, which legally banned discrimination in housing. The assassination of Dr. King, who was, of course, the ultimate champion of nonviolence, combined with the painfully slow pace of actual economic change, well, it shattered a lot of activists' faith in the system. Which brings us to Section 5, the rise of Black power. So the crucial point here is understanding exactly how the ideology of the movement shifted. The early movement was heavily defined by nonviolent integration, but post-1968, we see the massive rise of Black nationalism. This new ideology favored separatism and radicalism, essentially rejecting the old goal of integration entirely. The frustration was just so incredibly high that many folks completely rejected nonviolence altogether. In fact, organizations that were previously integrated, like SNCC and CORE, actually ended up purging white members from their ranks as this radicalism increased. And you can really see how the visual branding of the movement changed along with it. Gone were the conservative suits and ties of the early 60s marches. Instead, we start seeing these really powerful, assertive symbols like the raised Black Power fist and the bold, iconic logo of the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party became a major force in this new era, and they had a really complex platform that completely rejected strict nonviolence. Their operations included armed self-defense, and they had a clear mandate to protect their own communities from police brutality. But they also ran some really extensive social programs, like providing free breakfasts for local schoolchildren. However, we have to note that this radicalism and armed stance also escalated into very real, very violent conflicts, which even included the assassinations of police officers. It was a vastly, vastly different approach from the peaceful marches of the early 1960s. Whew, okay. That is a whole lot of history to cover in just a few short years. Let's wrap things up with Section 6, Lesson Review. Today, we've traced this profound journey from the really hopeful legal victories of 1964 and 1965 right through to the harsh systemic realities of redlining, the urban crises up north, the absolute tragedy of 1968, and the resulting radicalization of the Black Power movement. Which brings us right back to our original question to close out today's class. Think back to that sentence stem from the Do Now. Were African Americans satisfied after 1965? Why or why not? As you pack up, I want you to really reflect on how the legacy of systemic racism, de facto segregation, and economic exclusion completely shifted the fight for civil rights. And more importantly, I want you to consider how those exact same historical realities are still impacting our society today. All right, great job today, everyone. Class dismissed. I'll see you all next time.